Hi, in this video we're going to go through a general legal research strategy that you can follow parts of no matter what it is that you've been asked to find. Okay, so this is our basic world of legal resources. So we've got our primary sources of law on the side here, so the sources where the law actually comes from, where it's actually written down. So we've got our legislative sources up here, our case law resources down here. Now just to mention, there are a couple of stray extrinsic materials up in this top section here. So these are documents that are created as law is being passed through Parliament. So things like your bills and explanatory memoranda and your Hansard up here as well. So they're not primary sources of law themselves, they're just documents that are extrinsic to the process of acts being made. In the middle, we've got our secondary sources of law. So these are the sources that help us find the law. So find primary sources of law, learn about them, understand them and analyse them as well. And then on this side, we've got all the different places where you can go to find these different types of primary and secondary sources. All right, so if it's your job to be capable of finding the law, where do you start? Where in this world of legal resources would you go first? And how would you navigate through it to find the information that you need? Well, it depends on a couple of things. So it depends on what it is that you need to know, so what you've been asked to find, and also what you already know, so what you bring to the table already. Now, most daunting is obviously when you're asked to look at an area of law that you're completely unfamiliar with. So what we're going to do is talk through an overarching legal research strategy, and it starts from the point assuming that you need to know a lot about an area of law and that you come with very little knowledge about it already. Okay, so the first step is to find some clues as to what the law is and learn a little bit about it. Now, a lot of people are just tempted to rush to a legislation website or a case law database and just try and search for things that way. I mean, after all, that are the primary sources of law, that's where the law comes from. It kind of makes sense to just go straight there, but if you think about how many acts there are, how many cases there are, and how they're written as well, how detailed they can be, it can be quite overwhelming and quite confusing, and you can often waste a lot of time going down that path. So one of the things to do is to use the brainwork of other people. So pick the brains of experts who know about these different areas of law and who write about them in different ways. So places where they write about them are all those secondary sources. So dictionary is a great place to start. This will just give you a really quick idea about what that area of law is all about. Gets you used to some of the terminology that's used, and will usually point you to one or two primary sources of law that you can then follow up on. If the area of law is something that the general public is likely to have an interest in, so things like criminal law, family law, accidents, that type of thing, free websites will often have a lot of great information. So they'll usually talk about the law in a very kind of basic, brief way that just gets people going. And again, we'll point you to a couple of primary sources that you can follow up on. So that's great to just get some clues as to what the law is all about. And you can use those clues to research further. Now, one of the most underutilised secondary sources around are legal encyclopedias. These are absolutely brilliant sources that I can't promote enough, really. So these cover all aspects of the law within Australia, and they really give you a fantastically succinct but comprehensive overview of all aspects of different areas of law. So they tell you all the different legal principles you need to know in those areas, so all the different elements that you need to talk about to establish liability, all the different defences and exceptions that might be available to argue against someone arguing those aspects of liability. So they really tell you the basics of what you need to know for an area of law, and again, they'll point you to all the primary sources where those legal principles come from. So highly, highly, highly recommend legal encyclopedias. Books as well, another great place to go to. Again, these are written more for students. Encyclopedias are kind of written for practicing lawyers and students, so they're somewhat basic, but they can use quite legal terminology at times. Books written more for students, so they're written quite simply a lot of the times, although some of them are quite hard to read, but you'll often find that there's multiple textbooks on the same area of law, so you can pick and choose which makes most sense to you. So books are great. Again, they go through one area of law in great detail, and they're really good just to help you understand a little bit more what a particular act or case is all about, and it can help you figure out how to analyse it and apply it to the situation that you've been given. Okay, after reading a couple of these secondary sources, you should start to have a bit of a better understanding about what the law is and the parts of it that are important to the question you're looking at. You should also have a list of primary sources that you can start to follow up on. So remember, you don't want to cite the law as it's stated in these secondary sources. You want to cite the law as it comes from the primary source of law. So you actually need to go and find those primary sources and read them for yourself. So you actually want to read them, see what they're all about, and determine for yourself if they're actually relevant to the problem that you're working on. So for acts, you want to read it carefully, or at least read the sections that are relevant to your problem carefully. For cases, good idea to read the case in full, not just an extract of it, because you could miss some key context that's useful to try and understand how it might apply to your situation. Now, for primary sources that you do decide to use, there's a couple of extra steps that you want to do. For legislation, this means figuring out how to interpret it and how to apply it. So if you remember, words and phrases in acts don't necessarily mean what you think they mean. So if you need to be thorough, you'll want to check up on this. Again, there are resources that can help you out. So you've got your documents that were created as the Act was being passed through Parliament. So your explanatory memorandum and Hansard, really good to give you that background as to why the bill was introduced and what politicians were hoping that it would achieve. You can also look at cases, so that will give you a good idea as to how judges have interpreted and applied the Act to different situations. For cases, you need to follow up by checking to see whether the legal principles that they set out are still considered good law, so that they haven't been overruled or modified at any stage by later cases. You also might want to look at later cases as well, just to see how the legal principles have been used in other situations. Go-to resource for this checking up are your case citators, so Casebase and First Point. Now, once you've read these primary sources and you've done this checking up work, now might be a good time to search those legislation websites or those case law databases for additional primary sources. Now that you've got a good handle on what the law is, what you need to be looking out for, and what gaps you might be missing and things that you want to know a little bit more about. Once you've done that, you may want to look a little bit further again. So if there's something that you're completely confused by when you've been reading these primary sources, that's when you might want to go back to your secondary sources and see if they write about it in a way that makes a little bit more sense to you, because sometimes these acts can be quite convoluted, cases can be very long-winded, and these can really debrief them a bit easier for you. Now, if you're doing a research essay where you need to critically analyse an aspect of the law or legal system, that's when you might want to go for some more of these different resources that can help you do that. So you won't usually get that from your legal encyclopedias or books. Usually it's your journal articles, law reform reports, parliamentary committee reports that will have that level of detail. It's also good to know, though, that these sources will sometimes provide a really good little summary about what the law is, which sometimes can help you learn about the law too. So those can be a good starting point if you stumble across a journal article or law reform report on an aspect of law that you're interested in. So that's the broader strategy for researching an area of law that you don't know anything about. But as we alluded to at the beginning, if you've got some prior knowledge, if you know a little bit about the area of law already, or if you just need to look at into one particular case or one particular act, you can just pick and choose parts of this strategy. You don't necessarily need to follow the whole thing through to its conclusion. And like any other research, it won't always be a linear process. So as you read more, as you learn more, you might jump back and forth between your primary sources and your secondary sources and back and forth again as you try and figure out where the gaps are and what you need to know more about. And again, like any other research, it could be that you get to a certain point and realise that the information that you need simply doesn't exist. So a couple of examples in law might be someone's interested in a case that never went to court. You probably won't find much beyond a news report, so you won't be able to find a judgment and then find out how it's been used by later cases. That information just won't exist. Same for sections of an Act that have only just been recently added to the Act. Chances are there won't have been any cases that have talked about it as yet. It hasn't had the time to go through that process. So again, you'll get to a certain point and you won't be able to go any further.